Okay, so we're back. And one last point about the Senate before we move on. Again, take a look at section 23 and note that 23 is written with the male personal pronoun he. The qualifications of senators that he shall be of the full age of 30 years, that he shall be natural born subject of the Queen, that his real property shall be $4,000. He. Does this mean that a woman cannot sit as a senator? That was understood in 1867. Yeah, women didn't have the right to vote, even, of course, not until 1917, 1918. This Section 23 was subject to constitutional challenge in the mid 1920s. And finally, in 1929, in a decision by the British High Court of Empire, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and read Russell on this, the British High Court held that here, that he, the word he, should be understood as meaning he or she. So since 1929, women have been entitled to sit as senators. And again, highlights the importance of judicial review and Supreme Court and High Court of Empire decisions on constitutional provisions. We move on. Section Section 41. Now, many sections here we just get to skip over. Section 41. I won't read it. It's a big long paragraph. But if you do take a look at Section 41, it simply talks about the continuation of election laws in the in Canada, continuation of old colonial election laws. So Section 41 simply stipulates the importance of election laws and that election laws, federal, provincial, determining who could vote, how votes are going to happen, what type of system. Do you have paper ballots or do you have other types of ballots? Do you have ridings? How are ridings established? How are elections administered? All of this stuff is not covered in the Constitution Act of 1867. It's simply left up to the federal law and provincial law. And again, an importance of that, this is not the total Constitution, that other statutes, as Russell said at the very beginning, as a Constitution is a collection of laws and statutes and principles. And so here, Section 41 highlights that if you really want to know how elections are going to be administered in Canada, go to federal and provincial election acts and look at them. Section 51. 51, a very large, complicated section. You don't really need to look at it much, but just appreciate that in section 51, it is dealing with the apportionment of federal ridings. And in section 51, you're getting the concept of representation by population, that ridings should roughly have equal numbers of citizens in them. So 51 deals with representation by population. Sections 53 and 54 are important. They very much guarantee cabinet control of budgets and very much the importance of the House of Commons compared to the Senate, in that any money bill coming into Parliament has to originate in Parliament and has to have the approval of the cabinet. So only the cabinet can introduce money bills, but only the cabinet can introduce a budget. So that very much gives enormous power and influence, to, of course, to cabinet and the prime minister. Section 55 and 56, 57, we get into the imperial connection here. Just let me read you section 55. Where a bill passed by the Houses of the Parliament is presented to the Governor General for the Queen's assent, he shall declare, according to his discretion, but subject to the provisions of this Act, and to Her Majesty's instructions, either that he assents thereto in the Queen's name, or that he withholds the Queen's assent, or that he reserves the bill for the signification of the Queen's pleasure. What 55 means is that a governor general has the power to refuse to sign a bill coming from the House of Commons and the Senate, and that he reserves it. He reserves it for the Queen's pleasure. And of course, this means the Queen in England, the Queen in Britain, and the Queen now in Britain, subject to the advice of her British cabinet. Of course, the Queen, the monarch in Britain, doesn't have power here. They're subject to the rules of responsible government in Britain. So what you have here in Section 55, again, coming in from 1867 with MacDonald and the Fathers of Confederation, 55 means that the British, the Governor General, understood back then the Governor General was a British appointee representing the British government. The Governor General could refuse to sign a Canadian bill and refer it back to London to the Queen, officially the Queen, but back to the British government for their reflection on it. And then you see in section 56, read that, you see that in section 56, the British government has the power to disallow any Canadian act if it wants. And that's a legal power. And that 57, again, gives the British government the power to refuse to pass, to authorize a Canadian law. So 55, 56, 57, as written by John A. Macdonald and the Fathers of Confederation, is a British power to disallow Canadian law in the name of the empire. This is one of the reasons why the Constitution Act of 1867 was clearly not revolutionary, not like the American Constitution. The Canadians are very much saying to the British, well, you can trust us to govern Canada, okay, but if you ever think we're making a mistake, you have the power to refuse to pass a Canadian law. So this is an enormous power held by the British government. And these provisions have never been amended. This is still official Canadian law today. The British government has the power to veto any Canadian law. It's right here. You see it. But only once in Canadian history did the British government ever contemplate doing this. And that was 1875. I had to look. That was 1875 when the Canadian government was moving to establish a Supreme Court of Canada, and the British government believed that that would interfere with the British High Court of Empire, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, Reed Russell and all of this. And they just hinted, the British government just hinted that they might have to reserve and disallow such a Canadian act. And then the Canadian Prime Minister, then Alexander Mackenzie, the first Liberal Prime Minister, and sorry, sir, we didn't mean that. And the Canadian government rescinded this provision of the Supreme Court Act. We'll talk about that in future weeks when we look at conventions again. But again, that power was there, and is still there. Now, Section 58 establishes the position of the lieutenant governor of the province. Appreciate the lieutenant governor is appointed by the governor general in council. So meaning that the lieutenant governors in the province are appointed by the federal government, officially by the governor general. But with responsible government, lieutenant governors are actually really appointed by the prime minister. So this is a federal control over a provincial official. Most people think, well, the lieutenant governor in a province must be appointed by the premier. No, the lieutenant governors of the provinces are appointed by the federal prime minister. Now, Justin Trudeau. And so we're getting into the federal provincial issues now, and that will be coming up in the next video.